if we can just call you when we, like, if we feel like we can't do it
Yep.
ourselves, yeah?
Good morning. Welcome to Friday. You guys made it. 5 days of Digital Pedagogy Lab. You all deserve an award. A medal. Yes, exactly. We will have a procession later and everyone will get a medal. No, that's not true. We do some crazy things here, but that's not one of them. So just a couple of announcements before we get going on our keynote. First up, and you guys will all receive an email about this as well after the event is over, but we, whoops, wrong way. You've seen those. We will be sending out a feedback survey. Your feedback really matters to us. So please do take the time to fill out this survey. Over the course of the 3 years we've been offering Digital Pedagogy Lab, the changes that we have made to the event have been spurred on by comments that we've received from folks who attended. So it means a lot to us that you offer that feedback to us. So you'll have that opportunity. You can, there's the short link to get to the feedback survey, and so you can take a look at that. At any point today, I'll remind you again at lunch, and then you will also get an email from me. So we really mean it when we say feedback. Today, quickly virtually connecting, we'll be meeting with Martha Burtis, who is here at the Digital Knowledge Center at UMW, and Robin Wharton, who is one of the board members of Hybrid Pedagogy, Inc., and that will be at 1:30 today in room 307. And now, without further ado, I want to introduce Maha Bali and Chris Gilliard, our final keynotes for this event. In my experience, it's rare that anyone has had the privilege of introducing two such notable people as Maha Bali and Chris Gilliard. It is such an honor, not only to have these two educators present at this event, but that they agreed to speak, to take this floor, and as I understand is Maha's plan, to share this floor with you. Maha is in fact one of the most quietly revolutionary digital community leaders I've ever encountered. Her insistence on transparency, her dogged pursuit of equality, collaboration, fairness, and empathy does not just reach out over the miles between Cairo and here, or Cairo and just about everywhere. It settles on those who encounter it. She has initiated collaborations and relationships through a variety of connectivist MOOCs, including C-Courses, MOOC, Digital Writing Month, and Open Learning 17. She's also one of the most prolific education writers I know, publishing regularly on her own blog, Reflecting Aloud, and on Chronicle of Higher Education's Prof Hacker and DML Central blogs. She's an editor for Hybrid Pedagogy, the international director for Digital Pedagogy Lab, and the founder of Virtually Connecting. She is a force. Here's the thing though, Maha doesn't just write. She doesn't just volunteer her time. She doesn't just network and connect. She creates a deep, vital narrative across vast distances, across disciplines, across communities. It's extremely rare that I meet someone who doesn't know Maha and who has not been touched by her work. And I first met Chris Gilliard last year during the 2016 Institute, where he stood out as one of the most insightful, careful participants and one of the most compassionate listeners in Audrey Waters' Action Track. And then I read his work. Chris turns his considerable intellect and that same compassion, that same acute, intense listening on issues of privacy, institutional tech policy, digital redlining, and the reinventions of discriminatory practices through data mining and algorithmic decision-making, especially as these apply to college students. And that last is key. The focal point of Chris's work is students, their agency, their security, their rights. He's deeply invested in his work as a teacher of young people and is a perfect example of how pedagogy is scholarship. His inimitable intellect and his desire to protect and uplift those in danger of silencing and surveillance is a model for the practice of a critical digital pedagogy. Chris, too, is a force. And so it is my honor to welcome these two important educators to the floor to help us close out our week, ignite our minds, and open our hearts. Please welcome Maha Bali and Chris Gilliard.
Thank you for that, Sean. Wow, okay. I'm a little, I've never had that kind of introduction. So, I wanted to do something a little bit different, and being paired with Maha, that is not an issue. But I wanted to do something to address the events of the week, to respond to some of the events of the week. And it's my hope that my response resonates with people and resonates in the space. I wonder if I belong in these spaces, not because I fear being an imposter, but because I fear being too real.
We've been told we're not ready, or that we shouldn't try, or that we can't.
As an educator, my goal has never been to be a good capitalist. My father was a repairman, and I admired him. The recent history of Edtech tells us that entrepreneurs are not more daring. They have a better net. I'm a capitalist not by birth, or I am a capitalist by birth, not by choice. There is no ethical consumption, including of education, under late capitalism, but there are ethical choices nonetheless.
We've been told we're not ready, or that we shouldn't try, or that we can't.
Students are the reason we are here. When it's time to pick sides, I do not align with power.
We've been told we're not ready, or that we shouldn't try, or that we can't.
I'm glad to be here, and I honor the sacrifices everyone has made to be here this week.
For when we have faced
So that part was not planned, and I don't mean it wasn't planned as in I didn't think about it at all, but it's not what I intended to do coming to the Institute. What I wanted to talk about is a story and something that happened to a scholar educator that I really admire, and most of you probably know, Audrey Waters. And a few months ago, Audrey put out a blog post explaining her desire to not have annotations on her site. So she decided to put a script on her site that would block hypothesis. And as you may know, Audrey has decided, again, to not have comments on her site. And so that was another way that she was exercising her agency. And this is what she said. My blog, my rules, no comments. This isn't simply about trolls and bigots threatening me, although yes, that is a huge part of it. It's also about extracting value from my work and shifting it to another company, which often gets to control and even monetize the conversation. So a curious thing happened, or perhaps not so curious, in that many people in our community decided to attack Audrey for this choice. And I shouldn't be surprised, but I was. And I mean, I was there for that. Much of it played out on Twitter. And so I tweeted out a few things. And the first thing I tweeted out, I'm sorry, let me catch up just a second. The first thing I tweeted out, there we go, Maha, is people really need to think about how we or they absorb platform logics and how we operate on the web. Just because platforms take liberties with our digital existence, that doesn't make those practices acceptable. And so what I was seeing is that people were demanding engagement of Audrey in a way that is very reminiscent of how platforms demand engagement of us. And people were treating they were saying to her that just because you're on the web, you owe us something. And that was very problematic for me. It was very troubling. And so as part of the work I was doing for this keynote, I did a lot of work, a lot of reading on platforms. And so I just want to, for those not familiar, I just want to give a little bit of a definition and explain a little bit. So there's a book called Platform Capitalism by Nick Cernsek. And he says platforms are digital structures that enable two or more groups to interact. A platform provides the basic infrastructure to mediate between two different groups, while often presenting themselves as empty spaces for others to interact on. They, in fact, embody a politics. So in other words, when we are on platforms, we are embodying the politics of the people who made them. And that might be Twitter, and that might be Facebook, and that might be the LMS. But the investment of the people who make those platforms is for us to naturalize those relationships, to assume that they're necessary, inevitable, even that they're good. And they are sometimes some of those things, although definitely not inevitable and not natural. And Tarleton Gillespie talks about this also. Terms like platform institute a way of being, as Verdew put it. They sanction and sanctify a particular state of things, an established order, in exactly the same way that a constitution does in the legal and political sense of the term. So billions of dollars are put into these things to make us act this way. And that is what I saw when I saw people interacting with Audrey that way. And that is, it's a deep concern of mine in terms of how we operate in technological, how we operate when we use digital pedagogy. Because not only do they sort of tell us that that way to act is natural, right, but they limit our imagination in terms of thinking about what is possible. Now, one of the phrases that Audrey used is extract value. And I apologize for all of the people who have heard me say this 2 times, 3 times, 5 times this week. But it is that important to think about things this way, I think, in that everybody's heard of the Internet of Things, I assume. And so there are Internet of Things toilets and refrigerators and thermostats and sex toys and you name it. And the reason those things exist is not because they are better at their core function. It's because of the model now for companies to make money is to continually extract data, to take it from us, right? And again, that extract is the perfect word because it's often not that we give it away, it's that it's taken from us. And we can think about that in terms of things like toothbrushes and thermostats, but we can also think about it in terms of Edtech. So when you hear Netflix, but for education, Uber, but for education, when someone tells you that to fix our students, to fix our institutions, to fix our profession, to fix pedagogy, what we need is more data. What they are telling you is that they want you to accept extraction as the model for things. And I am here to tell you that I don't accept that model. So as I was thinking about this and I was reading about it these past couple of months, I came across a quote from Langdon Winter. He says, "A great many people, including some with considerable social power, seem to have lost the ability to link the specific concrete conditions of their own work to any reasonable conception of human well-being. The question just never seems to come up. To remedy that would require a fundamental change in orientation for many organizations, vocations, and professions." So here at Digital Pedagogy Lab Institute, I say that when we think about technology, and it's not a new message, but it's a message that needs to be reinforced, we also need to think about the human.
Which is a good place for me to come in. When this conversation was happening with Audrey, I think Chris and I were DMing, and he told me, hey, there's this conversation happening right now. And a lot of what Chris just said about platforms, I would say platforms are made by people. And you need to question who are the people in those organizations making those decisions. And when they are all white males, as a lot of edtech companies are, then you should expect that kind of outcome, because there isn't anyone in those organizations having a voice to resist that. And when they're there, they're usually token, and there are a few of them. And they need to fit into that culture. And so the ones that get in are probably fitting into that culture and still not resisting it enough because they were able to get in. And so even platforms that are good for certain things, if everyone in that organization is a white man, then there's already something wrong with it before you even find out what they're doing. And that conversation with Audrey, everyone who was resisting her narrative was a white man. They are wonderful people. I know them well. She doesn't. I know they are good people. They are otherwise empathetic people. But what I'm going to say when I have more time to talk in this keynote is that empathy is not enough. You need full participation. Inclusion is not enough. You need to give people rights to make decisions and not just to be there in your space that's on your terms. And what Audrey was talking about was that she had the right to be open on her own terms, not on some terms that someone else has defined. And one of the issues with the internet as a whole is that the whole internet is put on someone else's terms. And when you say, well, I don't like that I have to renew my domain every single year and pay with a credit card when people in my country don't have credit cards, and people say, that's the way of the internet. Well, we need to resist that and not say, that's the way of the internet, in the same way that we resist Twitter. In the same way, yes, it's a bigger thing to resist, but we shouldn't be okay with it just because it's there, and that doesn't mean that we don't use it. And I'll talk about that in a minute. But I also want to talk about Tim and Jenna here, because sorry for you guys, I'm not going to make you talk. But a while after the Audrey story happened, Tim and Jenna were conducting a workshop in which they were planning to annotate an article of mine. And for the first time, someone contacted me to ask my permission to annotate one of my articles. And I mean, there were two sides to this. One is asking the permission, because Audrey had made us all very aware that annotation is almost like commenting. But the other aspect of it is actually to make me feel honored that they were annotating my work, and to invite me to participate in the annotation of my own work and to interact with the participants in their track. And it was a very busy day for me, but it was a very fulfilling thing to be able to participate in that, and thank you. And it was an honor to meet you both in this institute. And could you move to the next slide? Oh, you forgot that one. Okay, we'll go back one. Yeah. And Sherry Spilitz, who was a fellow at the Vancouver Institute, responded to thank you, to what happened with Audrey. And she said, we as a species need to better acknowledge the power and privilege we hold, and to learn to check it across a spectrum of encounters and contexts. And we're all intersectional. I was saying recently that a lot of us here are marginal in some way or another, if only because we have dissenting views from organizations. But most of us are intersectional in different ways. But we still have privilege in other ways. I need to always have that in mind when we're making judgments of other people, when we're interacting with other people. And on to you, Chris.
So I had a little exercise. And if you have your phone out, or if you're connected to the internet right now, if you'd be so kind as to do me a favor. I asked several of my colleagues, who I respect very well, very much, to answer this question or to fill in the blank, right? And as educators, you're probably saying, why did you give them a fill in the blank? But I knew it would be, I needed something short is the answer to that. I needed something that could go on Twitter. So I'm asking you to fill in the blank. Platforms are extractive. Pedagogy should be what? And if you're willing to put that on Twitter, that would be fantastic. And I do mean that now.
Still not there.
Platforms are extractive. Pedagogy should be collaborative.
That's Kate Goodman. You know it's a digital pedagogy event when we're holding mics,
Right,
and
yeah,
phones,
phones, clickers.
clickers, all the tech.
Does no one want to help us out? Oh, wow.
Oh, okay, here we are. Here we are. Sorry, okay.
Okay. Platforms are extractive. Pedagogy should be participatory, from Rebecca. Platforms are extractive. Pedagogy should be fluid, equitable, and dynamic, from Catherine.
Catherine, your last name is Denial? Wow.
Dr. Denial. That's fantastic. Platforms are extractive. This is from Jeff McClurkin. Pedagogy should be empowering. Kate Bowles. Platforms are extractive. Pedagogy should be generous.
I love that one.
From Paul. Platforms are extractive. Pedagogy should be relational. And from Lisa, platforms are extractive. Pedagogy should be asking why.
I like
Oh
that
my
you
goodness.
flipped.
So here were some of my folks. I shouldn't say my folks, I learned today.
After that conversation.
Platforms are extractive. Pedagogy should be liberatory and generative. Platforms are extractive. Pedagogy should be participatory. Platforms are extractive. Pedagogy should be welcoming and expansive. And if you know Bill Fitzgerald, you know that he's not going to give me a one-word answer. Platforms are extractive. Pedagogy should be the tool that lets us cut through the elements of education and learning that are reductive. So I want to end, and I want to go through this kind of as quickly as possible, because even though I'm sitting up here, I think that both Maha and I agree that a bunch of this is about everyone in the room. So I want to end with this quote from James Baldwin. I'm going to parse it a little bit, but I want to end with it. So he says, to become educated, as all tyrants have always known, is to become inaccessibly independent. It is to acquire a dangerous way of assessing danger, and it is to hold in one's hands a means of changing reality. So when I think about the times we live in, when I think about hyperpartisanship, when I think about the filter bubble, when I think about coordinated attacks on the right, by the right, on scholars, especially black women, persons of color, LGBTQ community. When I think about this, and Pew just did a recent study that said, let me get this number correct, 58% of Republicans think that colleges and universities are a threat to the nation. So to use the word tyrant is not inappropriate. And so what is it? And one other thing, Jesse, in his keynote in Vancouver said, Edtech at this moment, putting us and our students at physical risk. So to use the word tyrant is not inappropriate. And so what does it mean to be inaccessibly independent? What that means is not that we don't have community, but there are times when you will need to stand independent of those and use your voice and your power in ways that, in whatever way that we can. And I don't want to shame people here, but there are some small things we could do that would make a huge difference. Do you laugh when a colleague goes into a rant about lazy students? Do you show compassion to your students or make them prove that their grandmother actually died? Do you consider issues of privacy and student labor that's not been uncompensated is the word I'm looking for, privacy and uncompensated student labor when you use technologies like Turnitin? And do you maximize your assignments so that people with limited technology access, limited broadband access, do you do everything that you can to make sure that they can thrive in your class? And these are all things that we can think about and do. And what does it mean to acquire a dangerous way of assessing danger? And so again, what we need to do is realize what those threats are, where they are, be very realistic about it, and do what we can to recognize them, assess them, and mitigate them. And lastly, he says, to be educated is to hold in one's hands a means of changing reality. And so what this week is about for me, and has been about, and I hope it's been about for you, and what I want to the extent that I can give you to think about, is to say that we do have that power. We do hold it in our hands, and what this week is an exercise in recognizing that we have that power, in recognizing it in each other, and in helping each other figure out how to best use it. That's it.
So I need to restart the keynote. But I'll still build on something that Chris was talking about. And in the ways you ask about how we understand our students and we support them, these are also the ways we support our colleagues who are less privileged than ourselves. And I think the way I got here was with a lot of support from Sean and Jesse, obviously. And they took a lot of risk in inviting me here. They invited me a year and a half ago. So this was way before we thought we would have this president. But in the midst of all of this, all the things that kept happening were like, would I be able to make it here? Would I be welcome in this country? And would I rather go to Canada? No. And taking that risk and making all these affordances for my family situation, for my religious restrictions. And I was possibly the most expensive person to bring here. And they did it with a smile. They didn't make me feel like they're doing me a favor. And they kept like, stop saying thank you. It's not a favor. We really want you here. And a lot of people here made me feel that way. And I actually got quite lucky that I kept saying, I'll get here if Trump lets me in. And the actual reason that I had a delay getting here, getting my visa, was nothing to do with Trump. Something to do with fingerprinting, which existed before Trump, so I didn't have a thumb fingerprint. And they couldn't give me a visa without the thumb fingerprint. So I had to wait until a thumb healed. But, and the thing is that there's a lot of horror going on at the macro level, and on the micro level, I've had a really good experience coming here. I've had border officers give my daughter stickers. I've had people in the airport comment on my beautiful headscarf, and I've had a lot of great welcome from over here. And at a certain point this week, earlier in the week, I said, I am probably the most other person in this room. And then later I thought, maybe I'm not at all. And I'll show you why I thought I was other, and then I'll tell you why I'm not other. I thought I was other because how many people, and some people will raise hands and they'll keep going down. How many people are not from North America? How many people are not from an English-speaking country and don't live in an English-speaking country? Not a single person here except me. One person. Hi, I can't see you. Hi. Okay. And I'm obviously wearing a headscarf, so the color of my skin could go either way, but the headscarf makes me really stand out. And in that way, I'm very other in my culture and where I'm coming from. But partway through conversations, I realized I am not other to this particular group of people in terms of my intellectual culture. When I discovered hybrid pedagogy, I went to my boss and I said, this is the only way I'm going to get back into Edtech, if I'm part of this group of people. And I sort of like followed them until I became one of them. And sitting here and talking to folks, especially in our track networks and intercultural collaboration, I didn't feel like I had to explain everything I was trying to say to people who didn't understand what I was talking about. And so maybe, again, this intersectionality of privilege, I have a lot of privilege in being understood in these circles and having a lot of friends in these circles that I don't feel like other coming into it. But I also understand that although a lot of people here look like they belong, they might not feel inside that they belong because they haven't been on Twitter and in hybrid pedagogy and all of that, and this would have been new to them, but it would have been less visible. And it's not always easy when some of us know each other very well and the others don't. And it's the same for our students as well, right? And I've had a struggle with this keynote in that being a closing keynote, if you know me, I don't like to center my own voice a lot, and I write a lot anyway, so I kind of feel like everybody listens to my voice all the time. Poor them. And as a closing keynote, I thought, how could I? And Chris and I have had this struggle a lot. How could I plan a keynote ahead of time before I have this experience with you all and know that it will be relevant? And at the same time, how could I center my own voice and talk about listening while talking about it? It didn't make a lot of sense. And that's why Chris and I kept revising. And every day we'd meet and talk and decide what we were going to do. And everyone would say, no, we want to listen to your voice. You're the keynote, so we want to listen to your voice. But my voice wants to listen to your voices. And what I was telling Chris is like, he chose certain quotes by certain authors. And instead of me choosing quotes by authors, I'm constructing you all as authors for my keynote. So I put in that survey yesterday to ask people to respond to certain questions, and I still ask the questions. So, and of course some people were able to say things outside of the questions, but I mean, I could have interrogated that of authors, I could have given mine, but I wanted to hear what you all said because then I could see the event from your eyes and not just mine. And that's still building theory, in my opinion. And people yesterday said we want a pedagogy of hope in this keynote, so I took out my copy of the Pedagogy of Hope. And I, Paulo Freire is quite, he's realistic about hope, right? Because when we're hopeless and we're despairing, then the consequences are inaction and immobilization, and we don't want that. We want to be able to move. And we need hope. We need critical hope, so it's not like uncritical hope where we're just hopeful and that's it, but like the way a fish needs unpolluted water, he says. It's very difficult to do all three.
It is. I can switch.
Oh gosh, yeah. Could you switch this?
Absolutely.
Okay. And so I'm going back to the idea I started talking about when responding to Audrey, and that's I'm thinking about participation versus empathy. And when we say participation, do we mean participation at the end stage of something or from the beginning in terms of design and implementation of a thing? And I'm talking about students, I'm talking about inviting minorities to a conference, I'm talking about every single aspect of our lives. And participation in ongoing decision making. So I saw Kate do this all week, where of course we're responding to what's happening in our class, in our group, but she was also spending a lot of time with folks outside of sessions, listening to how they were responding to the event and getting ideas from them of what to do next and so on. And allowing people to participate on their own terms. When Sean and Jesse invited us to do this keynote, we initially planned a blurb that was very participatory, like even much more participatory than this, and I said, I would like to participate on my own terms, not on the expected terms. And it's still halfway between what I wanted to do and because also Chris was resisting what I wanted to do. and then he messed up my survey by mistake, but that's okay. Because I made the mistake of giving him edit access because I gave him full participation into my part of the keynote.
That's where I would say, that's the danger of it, Maha.
And participation that isn't tokenistic. And I have to say that tokenism is a first step. Like, if you can't do more than that, let's start with that. But if you can go beyond that, that would be always a good idea. And participation that when you ask someone to participate, you need to give them the tools and resources to do that, to be able to participate fully. Because, for example, telling students you can change the syllabus or make comments on the syllabus, usually they don't. You have to make it into something that they can really make a difference in, rather than just throw them out there to do something they've never done before. They don't know how to do. So one of the things that I think helps a lot is culturally relevant pedagogy as an approach. And I don't know how many people know this book. Autumn got us this book. Amy got it for us too, but we'd already had it. Does anyone know this book? Yeah? Does anybody want to tell me what the best thing about this book is? And I'm gonna just come and I'll give you a gift if you tell me. Like, this is extrinsic motivation. For the first person who will speak extemporaneously in my keynote. Yes.
I got it.
So I really loved the book when I found it for you. I'd never actually read it, but I'd actually bought some books for Hoda when we were in London, and I forgot them in America. And so I went to the bookstore. And when I found it, I just loved it because it had all of these stories from all of these different kinds of women. And it was just like different religions, different ethnic backgrounds. It was very, very diverse. So that was one of the things I loved about it.
Yeah. The book has short biographies of women from all over the world, and for my daughter to see ancient Egyptian princesses, Arab women of this time, headscarved women, African women in that book, it really, of course the majority of them are still American and British, but there's a huge number of people who aren't. And to see a book where she can see herself, or someone like herself that she can look up to. How often do we give our students examples of that in our classes? I think it was Ashley Wade in her workshop yesterday about decolonizing rigor, where she was talking about, oh my God, all my readings are by African American women. And I'm like, yes, because there's so few courses where they're running across one African American woman, right? But in all of our choices, not just of content, but also of processes, how much of these come from a particular tradition, and how does that make other people feel included or excluded in what we do? And so if people have only ever been asked to participate in a particular form with particular role models, this is already restrictive, and it's not really participation. And this next one, does anyone know this one? Quick like move. Yay! What do you like about that book?
Well, it's a joy to read out loud. This allowed me to giggle with my children over and over again, and it really never got old. And there's, the idea that the duck is composing on behalf of the cow's labor, and there's just sort of this dialogue about extracting from creatures. And it's all sort of subversive, but it's done in a funny way that everyone sort of enjoys reading.
what I like about the book is that it taught my kids something about collective action when they were toddlers. So the cows collectively refused to labor on behalf of the farmer unless they get, oh, I'm sorry, spoiler alert, blankets, heated blankets, heated blankets. And now, of course, my kids turn this on me. Not that I'm asking them for their labors, but just homework. But it is age appropriate. It is context appropriate for young readers or young people being read.
It is about collective action for young readers. And what I thought was there are two. So in the book, the cows decide not to give the farmer milk until he gives them blankets, and then the chickens join them and they won't give eggs. And they type, no milk, no eggs unless you give us the blankets. But what I'm thinking is they had the typewriter. The farmer didn't realize their agency in using the typewriter. And it's very funny because there's a point where the other animals are trying to listen in and they don't speak moo. But for some reason the cows can speak English, but that's okay. They can type in English, but they can't speak. But one of the things is it's almost like the typewriter allows all the different animals to communicate in ways that they couldn't normally. And I think it's sort of a metaphor for the internet. And I wrote about it as a digital, and typewriters aren't usually considered really digital because, they were pre-internet and all that. But what was frustrating me near the end of the book is that the farmer makes a deal so the cows give up their typewriter to get the blanket. And I was like, oh, no, you're not. But actually, that's what they wanted. They wanted the blankets. The duck was the person who was passing the messages across. And what happened? Do you know what happened? The ducks took the typewriter and made their own demands, and the farmer never got the typewriter back. So that was cool. And I like that how different groups of us can learn from each other's forms of collective action and move on from that. But my point is, there are all these oppressive tools, but they're there and we can use them for what they offer us. And you can't dismiss the power of social media for things like the Egyptian Revolution. In spite of the way social media is used to surveil and put people at risk and all of the other issues with it, there are still opportunities to benefit from it that I think we wouldn't let go. And it's going to seem like this is all disjointed, but I think it's going to all make sense when you put it all together in the end. It's just that I had to add stuff from what was happening. So when in Sarah's keynote, it was a beautiful, touching keynote, but also very American-centric, so I think it made sense to most of you. And I understood what it was about. It's just that a lot of it wasn't something that I could take home. But one of the things that I really could take home and that resonated with me very strongly was the stories about students coming to your office and knowing them individually. And there are structural barriers to this happening a lot. So I hear administrators talk about, yes, you should mentor your students and have your office door open all the time. And why don't you teach an extra course with no extra pay? And I tell them, well, that's more time away from their office where they can't have students come in. Those are more papers they have to grade, and this is less time for them, therefore, to have conferences and one-on-one meetings with their students. So how could you say both? And I hear especially mid-level administrators not make those connections. But when we don't have those structural barriers, even other barriers like women who have young children and they can't stay at the office till late, for example, it's not because they don't care about their students, they have other priorities. But I asked folks in my survey to give me examples of ways that having students in their offices made a difference to the students. It was transformational. And all of the responses I got were ones where the support for the student was for the student as an individual and not from an academic way. I don't think any single story was an academic one, really. And I agree, because I've learned for the first few years I was teaching, I didn't invite students intentionally to come to my office. If they came, they came. If they didn't, they didn't. But when I started to do it, I learned a lot about things like mental health issues, struggles with living away from home, physical health issues. And also when groups of students came to me, they relaxed a little bit. I got to know a little bit more about their social dynamics, and I could understand the kind of struggles they had with group work and the kind of issues they had with my own class. And Mindy Urchel, I don't know what she looks like, but she offered that she could speak out about this. So.
So I talked about an incident where a student I knew really well, I'd taught in multiple classes, was doing collaborative research with her, where in the middle of a class period, I was working in my office, and she shows up, my door's open, and she's crying. And she just asks if she can come in and sit down. So I invite her in, I get her settled in a chair, I give her a box of Kleenex. And it's clear that she's not ready to tell me anything yet. She just needs to be there. So I let her know that I'm here. When she needs me, I'm here. And I always have my desk against a wall so I can face students. So I kind of turn and realistically pretend to be doing some kind of work because I can't imagine I was able to actually do anything. And periodically she'd say something not at all related to her distress, just kind of talking, and we'd talk for a few minutes, and then she'd want to be quiet again. And after probably about half an hour, she tells me that she left her psychology of aging class because they were talking about suicide. And she had had a friend commit suicide a few months before, and she just couldn't be in that room. So she just got up and left all her stuff in the classroom, texted a friend to say, when class is over, bring my stuff up to Dr. Urchel's office, and she just needed to be there. And we talked for a while more as she stayed long after the class period ended, and she was ready to go on about her day moving forward. But it was at that moment that I realized not only was I an academic resource for this student who I knew really well and felt close to, but I had become in that moment her safe place, right? She lived on campus. She didn't choose to go to her dorm room. She didn't choose to go be with friends. She didn't choose to go to the student lounge in the building. She chose to come to my office where she could be quietly and not be forced to disclose anything she wasn't ready to yet, but where she could get the support she needed. So it's at that moment that it really struck me how different my relationships with students could be and became without me even realizing it.
I think one of the things I thought about as I read a lot of these is, what is it that we do to be that sanctuary for our students? Like how do we give them that, comfort that they could come to us? And I'm not always sure what it is that people specifically do, but Sarah did give us some tips for at least letting them know that we're willing to, but I think a lot of it also to do with our demeanor. And another person talked about, Chris, could you move the slides forward? The one after that. Well, the one before that. Okay. Remote control. So one person talked about a student who came because she was afraid of a drug-abusing roommate who turned violent when she told them about the police, informed the police. Another student came to the professor. Chris, could you please? I'm moving quite fast, so. Okay, so a student who was pregnant, needed an abortion, couldn't tell her parents. So that's someone who found the professor's, a more safe space than her own parents. And the next one is someone who'd been sexually assaulted by a friend who was in a position of power in the university. And this one was really also important in the sense that the professor was able to then help that student navigate university procedures. These are all students stories from you guys, but some people asked to be anonymous. And that person then helped reimagine the procedures in the university as well, which I thought was also very helpful. And so, what was common, I think, amongst all of these, first of all, that the professor was there to listen, but also that they took action and found ways to support the student. And so saying that academics are all about talk and not action, that's not right. We know we're not all like that, especially not this group of people. And there was also something that I hope you don't mind me sharing the story from the Quran. There's a story in the Quran about Moses who's seeking knowledge from a man who's supposed to be really, really knowledgeable. I don't think this story exists in the Bible, actually. And the thing about it is that what it says in the Quran is that this person, God gave him mercy and knowledge. And when you hear the rest of the story and what he does, everything that person does, he does for a social justice reason, and that was more important, a lesson for Moses to learn, than the knowledge, the cognitive aspect of it. And I love this quote by Ruah Benjamin, which is about, why is it that we can imagine growing heart cells from scratch in a lab, but not growing empathy for other human beings in our everyday lives, and even more in our institutions? And I know that a lot of people in this room try to do that. And I think the value of that is so much more than any cognitive learning that we give our students in the classrooms. I'm going back to this issues of student safety online, and I'm inspired by Nishant Shah, who these aren't his words, these are mine, but he talks about how often we think about protecting students' privacy as in the sense of we choose how to protect them, whereas we could maybe ask students themselves to learn about what they're going through and then to make their own decisions about, have their own agency and how they protect themselves, knowing that students are at different levels of fragility and risk, and that they do not all require the same levels of support. And they're in college, they're not children. They should be able to make their own decision to see if those risks are worth it for them or not. I mean, one way, and the DPL folks have done this recently, is to read terms and conditions and then reflect on those together and interpret them. And then each person can have the choice to make, rather than have us hoard and protect them. And I'll give a small, I've had students who, when I use Twitter with them, tell me later, so I've not done this again in that way. They told me later, I used to be a Twitter addict and you got me back on it again, even though I gave them choices to be anonymous, to create a different account, but I still didn't even realize there was such a thing as a Twitter addict, which I probably am one, but I didn't realize it was a thing. But the thing is to also give students choices before they choose to use any tool in any way, even if it's just for a day, which was what I was asking those students to do. But there was an incident with Claire, who is a graduate student at University of Edinburgh, where she tweeted something to me and she tagged me on it. And I retweeted it and I tagged a lot of other people on it, and then it sort of exploded. And she's like, that never happened to me before. I write in public, but it's not the same as being in public in the sense of actually people reading it. And I know someone here who had that response this week to something she wrote. But when I said, oh, I'm sorry, I didn't realize, because you tagged me, I figured you're pretty well connected, you're confident, you know what you're doing. And then she said it was a good learning. I mean, she took that step knowing that this could happen to her. And in a way, she talked about how that was a good thing, that I pushed that boundary for her. Now she does feel more confident. So sometimes pushing a boundary slightly in a way that isn't really high risk, because it was something she wrote that would be of interest to these people, and she did benefit from it, and being extra careful wouldn't have necessarily been something that she was actually probably better off, according to what she said. And Laura tweeted this: who gets to tell our story? What are our responsibilities when we attempt to tell the story of others in digital images and words? And we need to think about that also for students in our classes. And I also, and I've said this week as well, is when we talk about risks and surveillance and all of that, I think it's really important to compare different types of surveillance and how we are subjected to surveillance differently from each other. And when I hear people sometimes, and Chris, you remember this conversation, right? What was it called? The one thing, what's it called? When they started to say that they might take your phone and ask you for your password and all that kind of thing at airports, what's the thing that people found? 1Password thing?
Yeah, 1Password invented some type of travel mode where you could essentially lock yourself out of your accounts and then reacquire your accounts once you were across the border or something like that.
Yeah, and I mean, I remember my immediate reaction when white men were outraged about this and thinking, is someone really going to do that to you? And what is the real risk you're taking when people do that to you? And when this 1Password thing came out, I was like, well, if I do it and people know this thing exists, then doing it will make me look like I'm guilty. And I usually, before I had my child, I was random checked 50% of the time because it's so random. 50% of the time I travel, I'm taken for a random check. But it's a little bit better now that my child is here. It's a little bit worse in England than in the US. But the thing is, if I do anything that's slightly suspicious, I'm much more likely to be considered suspicious than others. And so when I look at, I'm sorry, but like white men being worried about that kind of thing, and they probably don't have a friend of theirs who's a terrorist on their Facebook account, for example, and making all these efforts to, I think, I'm not diminishing that there are smaller risks and bigger risks, but I think that the size of your cry, like how loud you scream about something, compared to how I try not to do that when the risks are very different, I think it's that kind of thing. We really need to be aware of how much privilege we each have when we talk about that kind of thing. Okay, what do I have next? All right, and I have a small story about participation that happened to me this year in my class. Am I in the same place? Yeah. I teach educational game design, and I usually give my students a lot of freedom in what topics they choose. And people tell me, "Oh, come on, just give them some guidance." And I say, I help them brainstorm what they want to do, and then I let them choose. And of course, some voices in the classroom are stronger than others, and they get their way. But there's still some negotiation among the students. And this group of students decided to do a game about mental illness. And that, if you know me, this is a trigger for me because mental illness is not usually taken very seriously in Egypt. I was very worried about how that would turn out. And I asked them to go talk to a counselor at school, at university, to make sure that they were doing it properly and everything. But what actually turned out, and I found out later, is that one of the students in that group had a history of mental illness for herself and for her family. And the game turned out so, so beautifully. And I am sure it's because, not because that student had empathy for people with mental illness, but because a participant in the design of the game was someone with a mental illness. And it reminded me of this game called Depression Quest. I don't know if you guys know it. But the person who developed the game, her name is Zoe something. She herself had depression, and she developed that game to help people empathize with depression. But when the person designing something is a person who's living it, not just empathizing with it, it makes a big difference. And I think this is one of the things about virtually connecting, is that I am someone who cannot travel very often for events, and so I designed something to help people like me who can't go to events get a sense of how they want to be in that event. And maybe people who are different than me don't find it useful, but a lot of people who are like me do. Chuck Pearson, who's a good friend of ours, wrote recently about his own class, that responses aren't always most effective when they come from the voice of authority, but from a classmate who's had a different experience. And I thought about how to sort of end this keynote by listening to your voices about how the experience was for you. I was only in my one track and attended one workshop, but it's not the same as what you all have experienced. So what are some of the things you'll take back to your life beyond this event? And you could tweet some of these out if you weren't able to participate in the survey. I didn't get a lot of participation in the survey, and this is completely normal because they all didn't make me feel like I could do that, so I waited until the last minute. But also because when you open an invitation, a lot of people don't realize that you're talking to them until you target them. So can you please answer this survey? And also people have other things to do. So Rose wrote about gifting others to have a voice of their own in places and spaces they would otherwise never venture. And she sent me this beautiful graphic. This is me yesterday with all these different languages on voice and gifts. And Jenna Azar talked about taking back her own voice and agency. And that she could go back to campus with that renewed attention to that and looking for, working toward messy and unwieldy goals like equitable and democratic education are. And Valerie wrote about that she had observed some anger this past week, but that we're all in this together and with our institutions, and that we can turn that anger into progress on behalf of our students and the public good. Because anger and discomfort are not always a bad thing. They're steps in a process that I hope drives us to action. Someone who chose not to say their names talk about a renewed sense of hope and possibility in their ability to help faculty incorporate implicit design values, or course ethos, learner agency, and empathy. And one of the advantages of people who do come here with a cohort can then work together to do that much easier than the rest of us who will be alone back at our institutions. And here's someone who talked about learning about the notion of radical empathy and doing that in your course design, and focusing on both commonalities and differences, and that there is such a thing as an emancipatory curriculum that we can follow rather than the outcomes-based curricula that are shoved down our throats and don't feel right to a lot of us. And there are people who asked for, talked about concrete things that they think they'll take back, like the Sarah Golden Crabs section in the syllabus, encouraging students to come to you if they have food or housing insecurity. Certain icebreakers within tracks that some people found they could do in their own classes. And some people talked about benefiting from setting up a domain of their own. And Paul Peaton talked about new ideas for his courses and experimenting, but also more importantly, the unanticipated outcome of the week, which is having those conversations with close colleagues about non-academic issues. So back to that importance of the non-academic conversations, not just with our students, but also with each other. And I think, virtually as well, this is one of the things that helps build relationships. and to allowing ourselves to be vulnerable. Even knowing, I think, we talk about allowing ourselves to be vulnerable, but we also need to know that some of us cannot risk being as vulnerable as others and sharing those stories, but to whatever extent we can do it. Some others, again, talked about renewed sense of hope and possibility, and being able to work through these things together. And Bronwyn talked about modeling of humanity in the face of technology, which I thought that point that Bronwyn made was really important, because this is the digital pedagogy lab, but she talks about how much focus here was on being human and not letting the digital let us lose our humanity. And there was another question I asked about welcoming of unheard voices and how this happens. Have you seen that happen? And a lot of times, and this is very important to note, that a lot of us who speak about it will not be able to do it fully, and there is probably no way to be fully inclusive of unheard voices, because you don't understand every single unheard voice and every single person's situation. But there are still ways that it's been done well. And Brittany talked in her blog, she blogged about anxiety, depression, debilitation, and DPL, and the cognitive difficulties she was having here. And these are things that usually people don't talk about, and others, it's invisible to the rest of us. But how when she wrote about it here, she got a lot of support from people all over the community. And not all that support was digital, a lot of it was private and in between. And other people talked about the connections that they made and how those help make someone feel welcome despite the tyranny of academic spaces. And Miranda, you said you could say this out loud, so I'll give you the mic. Remember saying it? Like, I mean, say it.
You want me to tell the whole story, or?
Yeah, tell that story. I mean, it's not
Okay.
a story about DPL.
No, it's not. So, so my department is only like 30 years old, and the school's much older than that. And the department hadn't really changed since it was originally like founded. And being a film major, that means that a lot is changing all the time in this digital era. Like we still took 16mm classes, which was fascinating, but not relevant. And so when I transferred to Keene State, I had a lot of problems with the curriculum because I'd gone other places and I knew other places were doing things differently. And I met with my department chair and was like, hey, like we should maybe make some changes. And it was met with a lot of resistance. She took it very personally that I wanted to change the curriculum, like that what she had designed wasn't good enough, and that I was directly attacking her and her ability to kind of curate an environment for success for the students. So for a year, I worked with some of my peers and other professors to kind of get an opinion on the curriculum. And as a production major, there was only 4 required core classes for the whole major. And we still had to take all of the critical studies classes on top of our 4 production classes, and critical studies just had their critical studies. So we were taking more classes, but they weren't actually beneficial because there was only 4 of them. So we didn't learn any special skills or anything. So the department got really upset over the fact that we were like rallying against them. And it got to a point where finally there was like, I don't know what caused the break, but the department chair was like, all right. We'll hire a survey team to come in and we'll survey the whole department, and using those results, we'll take a look at them at the next, quarterly meeting or whatever. Just kind of assuming that it was just me and then like my 3 friends that I had convinced. Like she didn't think that the whole department was gonna actually agree that this is a really bad program. So they hired a survey company to come in and do an anonymous survey, and it turned out that all like 150 students agreed that the curriculum was wrong and offered suggestions for change. And I remember that moment where the department chair did call me down to her office, and she was like, I just wanted to apologize to you. I've not worked in the field in 20 years, and I didn't realize how much had changed, and that our curriculum is actually setting people up for failure in the industry instead of for success. And she apologized to me for, she felt bad that she had not done a good job listening to the students, and that she had taken it all personally. And she was like, I realize now that it wasn't a personal attack, that you were just trying to benefit yourself and your peers. And like, you're right, after doing some more research and after looking into a bunch of stuff and reading the results of the survey, like, we are going to make a huge curriculum change, and it happened. So this year, the incoming freshmen have a whole new curriculum. I spent my whole senior year helping redesign the curriculum so that it would be beneficial. Juniors and seniors are finishing up with this curriculum, but freshmen, sophomore are getting a whole new program that is designed for them to be successful and to be able to leave with a portfolio and demo reels and adequate skills in the film industry, as well as, you know, the critical studies knowledge, but not primarily that. So it was like a year of resistance and me fighting, and that was my first year at Keene State, and then finally it was like a breakthrough, but it's beneficial, and now anyone who goes to that program will leave and be successful, unlike all the rest of us who struggled upon graduation.
Thank you, Miranda. And one of the things Miranda also brought up was related to how to make it easier for student voice to be heard in this kind of event. And I realized partway through that we have several student interns who helped me very much. Thank you, Bethany, Stephanie, and Jen, with my child on one of the days. And I was thinking, oh, why aren't they in our tracks? Like, why can't we have more students in our tracks, or at least have, I mean, because Miranda was the only like youngish person in our track. You do awesome stuff. Do you want to tell us very quickly? No? I don't want to put you on the spot.
I'm involved in an experimental, very non-sanctioned experiment. I hide behind this thing called the independent study 3 credit that anyone can apply for, and so I do that. I have wonderful faculty who allow me to do stuff that's under the radar. So in a nutshell, I work with graduate TAs, graduate students, undergraduates, anyone who wants to do those 3 credit independent course, and they partner with me as apprentices, and we work, I'm an instructional designer, so I co-design and co-teach courses with faculty who are willing to experiment with me. And by allowing grad students to be my partners in crime, I did not say that, to redesign these courses, they get a say how these courses are going to be redesigned. And so it's very hands-on. It's not yet large scale, and I don't want it to be. We do it sort of one step at a time. So yeah, and Maha has actually seen it in action. I actually managed to bring 2 students totally under the radar, no budget. We went to OLC last year, and they had never done anything like it. And they presented, so that was wonderful.
And Chris has done work like that as well, but I won't. We want to leave time for questions, so we're almost done. I'm also asking, what if, are we one more step down? Yeah, I think. No, back. No, probably one more back. Okay, you were in the right slide, sorry. Thinking of, what if every academic journal and conference had diverse members with actual decision-making authority? Because I'm on a lot of editorial board teams, and a lot of them don't ask me for anything. I'm just like the token Egyptian person on there, because they have to have a diverse, but they don't ask me anything. They occasionally give me articles to review that are written by non-native speakers, because I'm more tolerant of the difference in writing style or something. But not all of them give me authority to actually make a difference in any way. And if I'm, again, the only one, that's just not enough. And it, there are conferences that have diversity boards, so people, or a committee that's working on diversity, but how many diverse people do they have altogether across the committees? Or do they just have a token couple of people who are diverse and then assume that they've heard? When, one voice among many is not much, really. And then just thinking about how different our courses, our workshops, our conferences, our journals need to be truly participatory, so that people who are different can get in there and actually make a difference and have their voice heard. And that if you think having them in and doing the same thing you've been doing all the time is a good idea, then you're not getting it right. And I'm sure a lot of people here know that. And I just, it's because I'm talking about participation, I realized while I was working on this that every single thing I've done in this event is part of a team. So I've learned a lot working with Kate on our track, with Chris on this keynote, and with Virtually Connecting, our team at Virtually Connecting. There's not one thing I've done here on my own, and it's so much better because we all work together on them. So much more work too, but so much better. And also gratitude to everyone here who sat with me at any point and spoken to me, because I've learned a lot more about your backgrounds and what you're doing here and why you're here and what you're liking here and what you're not liking here. And with that, I'm done. Thank you.
Mike is not.
We
Hello, Mike. Oh, yeah, we're on now.
They're saying we have time for Q&A.
we have remotes that we can run around with, and hopefully, in the spirit of their keynote, it can be as much conversation as Q&A. So if people have questions, you and Mike.
Cover that.
Well, thank you both so much for that. I'm a huge admirer of both of your work. You know that. And one of the things that I appreciate so much is the fact that you both encourage us to have a voice, also remind us of our responsibilities in having that voice. And I have a question that maybe isn't an easy one, because sometimes you guys maybe speak out to power in a way. Doesn't make it comfortable.
Can you elaborate on that?
Autumn, are you asking how we speak, we critique power without threatening, without sounding threatening? I don't know how. I know that I work on it. I know that I worked on my tone to find ways to be listened to without without being called reverse racist and things like that. I don't know that there's a specific thing, but I think it's just by listening to people respond to the work and just trying to modify that. But it's also problematic, because what happens sometimes is that I've toned it down so much that people respond and they actually haven't understood what I'm talking about at all. Whenever, and I'm at the institution that started Domain of One's Own, whenever I put forward a critique of Domain of One's Own, I get like 50 responses, and like maybe 5 of them have understood what I was trying to say. So that, yeah. When it hits something very deeply, it's very close to people's hearts, sometimes it's very hard to come through, because my context is so different. And people sometimes forget that, because I'm so active online and I can have all those conversations with most of you guys and I sound like I understand what's going on, but you don't always understand where I'm coming from. And so it makes it easier for me to talk about issues that are familiar to the white Western world, but much less so when they're issues close to my own context.
Well, I hate bullies. And as I said in my intro, I don't align with power. So when you have a modicum of power, those are some difficult values to navigate. So I guess one of the things I do is I find somebody I know well. If something angers me and I want to just smash, right? I find somebody I know well and I just let them have it. Like, I tell them everything. And lots of you saw that this week. And then, after I do that, I try to figure out what would be a more productive way to respond.
Other questions?
Yeah, this one's pretty basic, I think, but I'm asking Chris, so I don't know. So next Friday and following Monday, I've got my department and college meetings and so on. So I want to use some stuff from this and get about 10 minutes of time or whatever that I normally wouldn't have as a lecturer, but I'm going to ask for it. and I'm going to share some of this. But I want to make sure that it's okay because we had this discussion about Audrey, and I know where you are with privacy and so on.
Of course, yeah. But thanks for asking. Yeah, absolutely.
I actually have a question for you, Chris, and I think both of you can probably speak to this one. You brought up that issue of power. How do you navigate having power yourself? Whether it's in front of a classroom, I just got to have the pleasure of watching you teach, and I saw you navigate it really well. But I'm thinking about, how do you navigate power yourself when you're in front of a classroom? Or, I also think about myself reading your work and being a fan of your work. You have a lot of power on the page, just by the sheer fact of how good of a writer you are and how strong and how important the stuff you're saying is. Can you speak a little bit to how you navigate that?
Well, a couple ways. I mean, I've been doing this for like 25 years, and only in the last year has anyone paid attention. So it's pretty easy to stay humble. The other thing is, I mean, one of the things I try as hard as I can to do is in the classroom is get to know my students, right? So just a quick story, I always ask my students, well, what are your professors' names? What are your other professors' names? And a lot of times they don't know. And people take that as some fault of the student. It's actually the fault of the professor. The reason they don't know is because they haven't had conversations with them. And once you've had conversations with them, it's much easier to create a space where they have power, right? And I don't know if that seems too simplistic, but that's how I try to think about it.
I actually think that what you've done today models a response to the question that Jesse just asked. So power is relational. And the way I've witnessed you navigate relational power is one of the things I'm going to take back with me. Because in the context where I work and the people with whom I work, I think we try to stay aware of how in different spaces on campus, we carry different kinds of power. As the Associate Dean of Digital Learning, in many spaces I carry a different kind of power that I need to put on the line so that my colleagues, Jenna and Tim, can do the kind of work that they want to do. In other spaces, in the youth media space that I'm in with Jenna, she carries a different kind of power than I do by virtue of her closer connection and relationships with the young people with whom we work. And so it's shifting and it's contingent. And the gift of your keynote is not only the content of your keynote, but the process that has made the keynote visible here today. So I want to thank you both for that.
Thank you. And I just want to say there's an invisible part of the keynote that we've been talking to people all week long about what we're trying to do with the keynote and getting feedback. And yes, mostly it's people who are close to us, but it's still like not. There are a lot of people who have influenced this keynote whose names are not up there because I haven't quoted them. But
yeah, I don't know if this person wants me to identify them, but this week he said to me, well, if you're not giving whoever's on top of you in terms of power, if you're not giving them a rough ride, you're not doing your job, right? So, I mean, and I don't want this to sound paternalistic, but I mean, my job is not to align with power; it's to align with my colleagues and the people who have less power than I do, always.
I think we didn't talk to Sean and Jesse at all about what they wanted from the keynote once we got here. We didn't care. We told them, this is what you're going to get. And they're like, okay. But we talked to everyone else here. So. Give me a really scary look, by the way.
We didn't expect you to talk to us about your keynote.
Other questions or comments?
I guess I have a practical question, and I have the advantage of working here at Mary Washington, so I've been able to invite students this week. I think Brandon and Claire are currently watching the stream. Hi, Brandon and Claire. And they asked me earlier this week, so what is pedagogy? Like, they're starting at a very low level. Like, they're students here, undergrads. How do you, besides like inviting them to things, just get them involved in a conversation that is full of jargon, other things that they just don't understand, besides continually inviting them to things, just like practical ways of talking about being lifelong learners and teaching? Like, they can understand content, but how do you talk about the fact that we all, like, they were kind of interested that we all deeply care about how we're teaching. They're like, oh, like, faculty get together to talk about these things? Like, how do we begin to really draw students into, make them realize that we do care about the ways we're teaching them, and get them involved too?
I was just going to say, I think we do have the language to do that. I think we just need to be aware when they're in the room to use that kind of language. I mean, I teach educational game design as part of a creative thinking core curriculum course that those students are not education majors in any way. They know nothing about anything about that. And they're in this course because they have to fulfill a requirement that it's one of the choices. And in half a semester, they can sort of navigate that. I don't have a specific thing to say, but I do know that we have that vocabulary. It's not that because we're professors and we use the big terms that we've forgotten the simpler ones. I just remember that they're there, and we'll I think, even to be honest, even faculty at my institution often don't understand a lot of the terms that I would use anyway. So that's already, when I give a workshop, because I'm a faculty developer, when I give a workshop, I already use different terms than I would use in a paper that I write. And oftentimes, like, asking the right questions, I think, matters, because I think Gardner Campbell was talking about this recently, is if you ask students sometimes what they want in a particular way, you'll ask them to say the answer that gives them the easiest grade. If you ask the wrong question, and they'll say things like, I don't want too many tools or whatever. But if you ask the right question, I think it would make a difference. But I also think, because this question is about students, I think the students should answer it. So whoever is here who would like to answer it either now or later could probably do that much better than I could, and say if that actually makes sense to them.
We have time for one more question. Yeah. Better be a good one.
It's totally simple. I was curious. I noticed both of your Twitter handles. Can you explain your Twitter handles? You don't go by, one doesn't go by his name, and I'm just curious about it.
It's mildly ironic in that I deal with privacy, and I call myself hypervisible. So I take some pleasure in that. The other thing is that, it goes back to my dissertation, and my dissertation was a discussion about the change in visibility of black athletes and the models of blackness that we go by, right? So if you think about Invisible Man to what some people call a hypervisible black body, right? So try not to see blackness on television, but how is it experienced, and how different is that from the narratives from before? Not very, actually, but so I answered my own question, but that's where my Twitter handle comes from.
I have a few years ago, I think I noticed that some women have the word PhD or doctor on their Twitter handles. People like Tressie, Mia Zamora, quite a few. And I asked them why they did that. And I think part of it is women, to be taken seriously online, I think women need to behave slightly differently. And for me to be taken seriously in a social media space, I try to use my real name. I try to show somewhere in my profile that I have a PhD somewhere along the way. And I think I have less leeway to be playful. And especially as an Arab woman, I don't want to get followed by men who think I'm there for a fun time. And so that's really important to me. The thing is, the reason my Twitter handle is Bali_Maha rather than Mahabali is that I did create a Mahabali account in 2008, which I never used, and whose password I forgot for a while. So when I decided to get active in 2013, I couldn't remember the password. I created this other one. And then I remembered the password for the old one. But by then I'd had like 2,000 followers, so it's too late. So thank you for that question.
So we are officially out of time. However, we have about 15 minutes before you have to be back in your tracks. And so I want to use this time that if anyone wants to chat one-on-one with either of our keynotes, I'm sure they would appreciate that. Otherwise, up at 10:45, up in your tracks. And then we will be back. Just a reminder that we will be back here for lunch.